Okay, so we're gonna say this force. They established a rally point initially at the ground level. They found a building represented by this cardboard box. They want observation, point fire weapons to try and overwatch and patrol. Now, they're not going to let the patrol get too far ahead before they got to go and catch up with them, right? So these little rally points, they can be temporary, they can be fast, depends on the mission. But generally speaking, we want somebody who's able to observe from that point. We want somebody to be able to shoot from that point. And then we want somebody to be able to communicate with the outside, meet up with any of these guys. If they run into a problem, they scoot back here. So it's that's where our medical carry area is. It's an overwatch point, and it's it's also where if they get reinforcements, they're going to enter the scene from here. If you're doing a airsoft game and you want to be able to recirculate your guys, or if you're doing military training with blanks and miles gear, this is okay when your referees are here. This is what you'll establish as a spawning point. This is where the referees, we got the little key thing for the miles gear, and you can turn off somebody's beeping or that sort of a thing at the spawning point. Okay, so the unit, let's assume the unit gets up to a point and you've had some enemy force, or just for whatever neutral reasons, there's barriers. Okay, now the barrier is going to serve a couple of different things. One, they can stop somebody from taking a certain path, they can slow them down, or they'll turn the enemy. They'll make the enemy take a different path. So generally speaking, if they run into somebody who's using, they find an area where, let's say there's a natural barrier between some area where they could be shot at. There's a natural barrier, doesn't prevent fire, but it does prevent movement. If somebody's going to ambush these guys, like the Green Force, they're really going to want to look at that. They want to look at some kind of a barrier that doesn't necessarily prevent fire, but it does prevent movement. Deep ditches, rock walls, maybe a bunch of concertina wire, maybe wrecked and burning vehicles, and preferably something that's kind of a natural barrier. Although in a battlefield, that concertina wire becomes a natural part of the environment. It's going to be around. But if you see something that was freshly or hastily put in, it may have been put in by somebody who is planning an ambush at this thing. So as the group is continuing to the objective, which here is represented by the crashed helicopter, they reach another barrier. This barrier might be temporary in nature, but for whatever reason, it's blocking their path of travel. 99 times out of 100, what happens when a patrol element or an engagement element runs into a barrier? I'm sorry, happens every fucking time. They stop and have a conference call with the leadership element. Whoever's leading that little patrol may not be in command of it, may not be the highest ranking guy, but whoever's the actual patrol leader, they tend to go up and they have a little fucking confabulation conference call right there at the barrier. Happens every time. And this is where this lead element is a decision-making element. Now, remember, when they run into this, there's another decision-making element that's probably nearby. And it's either going to happen here or it's not going to happen here. Either it's just another wrecked vehicle among a bunch of other wrecked vehicles in that area, or this was the barrier that denotes the end of a kill zone, and most of that squad is in that kill zone. And oops, they get fucked. Now here's the thing that happens. Paranoia and boredom levels play against each other. So they're going to have an instinct to know and understand whether boredom has taken over and they just got to step around and go around that barrier and keep going, or whether paranoia is legitimate and they're about to be attacked. So these guys right here have an advantage in that they know what's going on. Hopefully they've had some level of communication for them with an element. If this force is so big and so shit hot that these guys really need to withdraw, that's what they're going to do. But that decision would have been made before these guys got to this barrier. Because if this is a big, heavy-duty, powerful force, these guys know they really can't take them down. They're just going to ask somebody to fire some distraction shots and go. And this is where, on a patrol element, reacting to a near ambush or far ambush is not their prerogative. Because the thing is, if an ambush was set up this way, they're not really going to know whether it's a near ambush or far ambush. Because what's going to happen when these guys decide, these guys have more eyes, they had more eyes on this movement as it moved through. These guys are going to make that decision whether or not these guys can handle that initial exchange with these guys, okay? If they see these guys carrying a bunch of high-end grenade launchers and heavy firepower and maybe have an armored vehicle or two in the mix, they're going to tell these guys, listen, you can't handle that ambush, we're going to get you out of there. And remember, these guys are generally going to be in hiding anyway. So at that point, if these guys have been told to withdraw, that's what they're going to be doing. And these guys are not going to know the difference between whether this was a near ambush that simply never got initiated or a far ambush because a command goes over to these guys to start shooting. If these guys start shooting and it's a far ambush to delay these guys, this may be a situation where the command element, if communication is good, a fight starts. Okay, these guys have made a decision. They're there. They've gone into their herringbone. They've gone into their patrol stop. These guys are only engaging point targets. Their rules of engagement never change on a far ambush or near ambush. Because they are a far ambush at this stage. And these guys may or may not know. Now, their rules of engagement may be to either escape or engage these guys. So it's possible that they could be sending an element out to go after this guy. They may call fire. They may do what they do. Don't forget, they've got a rally point. They may try to get eyes on the target. At that stage, you just don't know. And you're going to make a decision on whether or not to fortify this position and fight or to leave. That's if you've been ambushed. Let's say somebody's down. Okay? Somebody grabs them. They grab these guys. They go back to the rally point. A couple more guys go down. They grab them. They go back to the rally point. At that stage, somebody probably needs to figure out to engage these guys. But remember, they weren't the objective. The objective is the crashed helicopter. At that point, decisions get made whether or not to call back up or continue moving. And in those elements, we're going to talk about a little bit about what standard operating procedure is and why a lot of times it doesn't last through an ambush. Because at this point, people need to be able to know what kind of an enemy they're up against and what's going on with respect to what they expect to accomplish that day. My call in a situation like that, get everybody back to the rally point. We've had a far ambush. I want to have somebody out here who just continues keeping fire on these guys so that these guys can move. We're going to keep their heads down. We're going to try and kill them. We're going to keep engaged with them. We also want to make sure that somebody has a pretty good idea by continuing to exchange fire with them where they are. And you may call fire down on them. You may do whatever you do. And then assume that if anybody has started shooting at you, all or most of your group is probably in a kill zone. Okay? All or most of your group is probably in a kill zone. Now, when I talk about an ambush group, if they're doing things right, they set up a barrier where the barrier prevents movement but probably doesn't prevent fire. Okay, probably doesn't prevent shooting. In this instance, because it's a far ambush, the barrier is actually the distance. Okay? These guys have long-range weapons. These guys may have long-range weapons, but they are probably, because there's so much distance involved, they're probably not going to try and maneuver against each other. The barrier in a far ambush is distance. In closer ambushes, the barrier is either going to be a natural or artificial barrier. In either respect, if you've been hit, you need to see where the barriers are. And look at the barriers and make your own decision on whether or not you think those barriers were placed there by an enemy to channel your movement or stop you from going in that direction, or whether or not it's just a coincidence. At that stage, standard operating procedure has been that what the enemy least expects is for you to assault in force through the barriers. Okay, there's two ways this is going to go. One, if you go to assault in force through this barrier, you still need to, let's say you start setting explosives on this, okay? You have some breachers, you have some engineers, you start setting explosives on here.